Good morning, Ed Larkham here. Simple Human Action, a channel dedicated to sound money and its role in creating stable economies, strong communities, and prosperity for all. In this episode, I wanted to shed a little light upon the context of how societies develop and prosper along the lines of personal freedom and sovereignty. If we consider the last 500 years as our frame of reference, we can see how we have developed Western societies from divine right kings and numerous autocracies to recent concepts of constitutional democracy and the importance of freedom for the individual. Today, these concepts are sinking into obscurity, vaguely understood by the public and poorly observed in the halls of power across the world. I will make the argument that sound money, backed by gold, creates economic stability and prosperity for all individuals, and that fiat currency that we have today is a noose around the neck of the public and is a form of indentured servitude that deprives 90% of us of the real fruits of our labors. The real wealth of productive efforts is usurped by governments through inflation of the money supply. We have spoken about this in other episodes. But what is meant by indentured servitude? Well, one can define being indentured as the state of being bound to service by an indenture or contract or a form of legal agreement. Servitude requires no further definition from me, but there could be some comparison to the situation in which I find myself with Julia. She has discreetly maneuvered me into a position where her every need and wish is obediently fulfilled by, yes, yours truly. A good comparison to our current democracies? No, not really, but it does illustrate the point of voluntary servitude, and that leads me to our next illustration from history. The ideas of individual sovereignty, free from monarchical rule, have existed for centuries. One of the great expressions that in many ways set the standard for the ideas of personal freedom as represented in the American Constitution and the French Republic can be found in the extraordinary essay written in 1548 by Etienne de la Boétie. The context and environment within which discourses on voluntary servitude was written was the age of divine right and absolute monarchs, at a time when great religious animosities and international intrigues ruled the countries. Entire populations were essentially the property of monarchies and subject to the whims of the crown, with no option to opt out. Individual freedoms and liberty of the wider populations were non-existent. However, in this environment, La Boétie sets out the case for the wholesale rejection of autocratic rule and resolves that authority of this rejection rests with the people. The case is made that tyranny exists because people allow it. Wide rejection of tyranny by a population will overthrow the oppressor. One recalls the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the euphoria that accompanied that event. The overthrow of the proprietary right of communism. This translation from Discourses was written by Harry Kurtz of Queen's College in New York in 1943. In his introduction, he places servitude volontaire in its context of intellectual thought. Most scholars are agreed that the servitude volontaire is not to be considered a transitory political document written to fit some particular emergency. It seems to be instead a serious contemplation of man's relation to government, which fact makes it indeed the living document it is today, and ever will be. Just as Machiavelli's system may be termed autocratic and Calvin's theocratic, Laboetis is obviously one of the earliest Christian demonstrations of a new ideal in government, the democratic. For the author clearly states that men are born free and equal. The title he chose for his tract, Voluntary Servitude, proves that he considers the people responsible for their enslavement to a despot. He feels scorn for the tyrant, but also contempt for the nation submitting to him. Laboetis' genius consists in realizing and stating succinctly to his times the idea of the inalienable rights of the people, the very rights claimed for us in the preamble to the American Constitution. The entire discourse breathes in with this sentiment of the dignity and intrinsic independence of the individual. Although he sounds unsympathetic to populations who are subjected to such tyranny, he was careful not to stick his own neck out too far and be a firebrand for civil unrest. This would inevitably have placed him in some significant personal risk. But he defines eloquently the nature of the devices of how tyrannical rule of monarchs and despots is effected through mystery and reverence to compel obedience. The earliest kings of Egypt used swastikas, rising suns, fasces. Fasces are bundles of rods bound together, usually with an axe tied into the middle. And that was a symbol of power and authority. And of course, this was adopted by, yes, the fascists of Mussolini's era. They rarely showed themselves without carrying a cat or sometimes a branch or appearing with fire on their heads, masking themselves with these objects and parading like workers of magic. By doing this, they inspired their subjects with reverence and admiration, whereas with people neither too stupid nor too slavish, they would merely have aroused, it seems to me, amusement and laughter. It is pitiful to review the list of devices that early despots used to establish their tyranny, to discover how many little tricks they employed, always finding the populace conveniently gullible, readily caught in the net as soon as it was spread. Indeed, they always fooled their victims so easily that while mocking them, they enslaved them the more. This very process has happened time and time again over the millennia. We have a tendency to think that this cannot possibly be happening in our age today, that we have matured as democratic nations and have enshrined in our constitutions protections that ensure individual human rights and freedoms and liberty. I would simply point out that where some overt symbols have retreated into antiquity, they have been replaced by a financial servitude to a fiat currency that captures nearly all of the population through financial servitude. Consider the monetary progression from about 1900. A gold-backed currency provided much of the innovation and economic progress that defined that age. Monetary surety gave confidence to industry to improve the lives of many. Then gold backing of the currency was suspended to fight 2 world wars and allow governments to simply print money to finance these disasters. After the Second War in 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement results in gold being valued at $35 an ounce, and that backed the currency in so much that it was convertible for international trade settlements. But 1971, the US government had created so much currency that this debasement of the currency caused France in the late 1960s to demand settlement of international trade not in dollars, but in gold. They required their gold to be returned from US vaults to Paris. Now we enter the age of fiat currency, and 50 years later, we are now witnessing what will be the end of fiat currencies that rely on the trust and faith in the issuer. This process has taken over 100 years and extends generations, so that we now have no reference point for life under stable and sound money. And this is the crucial point. No government should be in charge of the control of the money supply. It belongs to the people within any particular nation. The debasement of the currency has happened time and time again, and our age is simply no different. This takes us back to one final observation from La Boétie, which perhaps our own politicians and central banks rely upon. One never pines for what one has never known. Longing comes only after enjoyment and constitutes, amid the experience of sorrow, the memory of past joy. It is truly the nature of man to be free and to wish to be so, yet his character is such that he instinctively follows the tendency that his training gives him. Let us therefore admit that all those things to which he is trained and accustomed seem natural to man, and that only that is truly native to him when he receives with his primitive untrained individuality. Thus, custom becomes the first reason for voluntary servitude. Men are like handsome racehorses who first bite the bit and later like it, and rearing under the saddle a while, soon learn to enjoy displaying their harness and prance proudly beneath their trappings. Similarly, men will grow accustomed to the idea that they have always been in subjection, that their fathers lived in the same way. They will think they are obliged to suffer this evil, and will persuade themselves by example and imitation of others, finally investing those who order them around with proprietary rights, based on the idea that it has always been that way. Well, Julia calls me, and of course her wish is my command. How did I become so obedient? I guess it is just human nature. We all have our own habits of following deeply ingrained dogmatic thinking. Dogmatic, wasn't that punny? And on that note, I think that when one considers our own monetary predicament, we can see how it is steeped in deeply ingrained Keynesian dogmatic thinking. All government policies now require total control of the currency. Most governments and central banks are effectively insolvent, and it is only the desperate adherence to their fiat currencies that props up the precarious monetary system. One need look no further than the bond markets to see the extent of the rot. The quantitative easing policies now threaten to shake the house of cards, and no amount of policy sleight of hand will be able to prevent the collapse of those markets as the wholesale rejection of the fiat currencies approaches. One can only hope that a wider discussion soon embraces the merits and the necessity of sound money, whereas it will no doubt be viewed as kryptonite to central banks and governments. It will undoubtedly be a most welcome opportunity for all citizens with a vested interest in restoring a prosperous economy and healthy communities with stable and sound money. Well, thank you for listening, and I shall leave you in peace. I hope you enjoyed this little journey into an old and dark recess of poignantly appropriate history. I hope you'll consider hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel, and I will look forward to chatting with you in the next episode. All we need is simple human action.